Thanks, Roger. It's fantastic to be here. It's a real joy to be at this conference. I'd like to thank the Dean, the Yale Law School, the Reich family, and everyone who is acknowledged on the back of the program for all they've done to keep Charles's memory alive. I want to start with a story with which I'll also end, the story of Charles and the purple chair. It dates back to the first year I met him, 1991, when Yale's greatest and most generous dean, Guido Calabresi, brought Charles back to teach after Yale Law School after many years away. And it turned out that Charles's office was literally just around the corner from my office. And so we quickly became friends. And one day after a remarkably warm lunch, Charles and I stopped at my office, which was just 2 doors down from his. And we were standing in the entry to my office, at which point suddenly Charles spied in the corner of my office a purple chair. The chair actually looked more like the chairs you're sitting in if they were purple, but this is the only one I could find on Google Images. And Charles just stopped dead as if transfixed, and he said, "Where did you get that chair?" And the truth was that I had picked it up in the trash in the hallway. That's how they used to supply us with furniture back in those days. And Charles went and he just kicked over the chair with his foot. And on the bottom it said, Reich. And he said, my chair, can I have it back? Can I have it back? So what was I going to say? And he jumps up and he runs into the next room, his room, and he puts it there, and there's the other chair. And he says, when I left Yale 20 years ago, I asked Burke Marshall to keep these 2 chairs for me. When I returned, there was only one. I felt lost without its companion, but now, finally, I'm home and I'm whole. It's a true story. So he sat in the chair, and he looked very pleased. I'll never forget the expression on his face. Now, why do I tell this story? Because it's an inspiring tale of personhood, community, and how one fosters the other. The story of Charles and the Purple Chair reminds me of my favorite book as a child, Harold and the Purple Crayon. You can imagine why it was my favorite book. I think it's the only time the word Harold was ever mentioned in any childhood literature. And even though I never got another chair for another 5 years, and so the students spent a lot of time standing up in my office and pacing around because I didn't have a chair for them to sit in, I felt like it was worthy. Now, if you remember Harold and the Purple Crayon, he is someone who builds great worlds. He's a curious being who sees what others can't see, and he strives mightily to get there. And in doing so, he's endlessly inventive, stunningly able to create with his pen remarkable worlds that others can only see dimly, a bit like Charles Reich himself. So what exactly was his intellectual journey? And let me suggest that Charles's lifelong struggle is to answer 3 questions, which I'll call identity, community, and power. The question of identity, who am I? That was really the question that guided his memoir, The Sorcerer of Bolinas Reef. The question of community, who are we? That is the question that drives the greening of America. And the question of power, how do we go about opposing the system? That was the message of his final book. How do we as a society prevent forces we have created but lost control of from destroying the law, individuals, and communities that make us human? Interestingly, Charles's answer all 3 questions, who am I, who are we, what is power, was all the same, that human beings must shape the law that they've created to be a servant to human needs, not the other way around, that lawyers and judges must recognize property and due process is in the eye of the receiver, the person on the receiving end of state power, not from the state that's on the delivery end. And properly understood, these concepts that Charles pioneered, the new property and the new due process, can empower individuals to gain space in which their own personhood can flourish by forcing the state to respect their communities. Last night, Guido put it best. He said, Charles was one of those very rare people who for some reason was always slightly out of phase with the canonic vision of their time, and as a result sees things everyone else misses. When one combines that fundamental diligence of vision, difference of vision with great intelligence and superb writing skill, one has the rarest of things, a true visionary, a prophet. But what was Charles's journey to get there? How did this unique vision arise? And then how did it affect his intellectual work? How did it lead him on his life's great quests, the search for the meaning of personhood, the search for a community, which included his embrace of environmentalism and opposing the system? So Roger has told you a bit about who Charles was. He was born in New York City to a hematologist and a school administrator. And he learned his father's diagnostic techniques and tried to apply them to the law. He went to Oberlin and Yale Law School, where he was editor-in-chief of the Law Journal. There he edited a comment on the right to travel and the right to carry a passport that started to shape his view on the individual and the state. He clerked for the great Hugo Black in the term when Brown versus the board was decided. And as Guido mentioned last night, he actually lived in Justice Black's house, and so spent literally almost all of his time with Justice Black. And he came to see his role as a defender of the living Constitution and a protector of the individual to whom the Constitution belonged. In his Toro Law Review piece, Charles said, "The year profoundly renewed my idealism and belief that justice is the foundation of society." And in the first article that Charles wrote, the first major article, Mr. Justice Black and the Living Constitution, he identified what the individual is working against, the trend in America away from its traditions toward strong central government, economic collectivism, and organizations, not the individual. Now, after that, Charles became a young lawyer in Washington, working at the the Arnold and Porter law firm. And what he described in his letter to Sarah Barrett is what one might consider the anomie of a young corporate lawyer. I experienced it myself. In The Sorcerer of Bolinas Reef, which is such an incredible book, he says, "The truth was I was spending my life in ways that were never what I really wanted to do. I didn't want to be in Washington. I didn't want to work for a law firm or even be a lawyer. I did not feel drawn to the people I spent time with. I wanted to be somewhere else, doing something totally different, with people who were excited, adventurous. In my practice, there was no grandeur, no public service, no commitment to a cause, no people to be close to, no sky, no sea, no forest, no mountains." So even though beautifully dressed, richly paid, he was deeply connected from his own personhood. Interestingly, one of the people who helped him address this was his second great mentor, William O. Douglas. And he describes in Bolinas Reef how he would get calls from the charismatic Douglas and say, "Want to go for a walk, Charlie?" And they'd walk down the C&O Canal. He was one of the early environmentalists. We'll hear more of this from my friend and colleague, Doug Kaisar, knowledgeable about, that should be plants, fish, animals, concerned about climate pollution and land use. As Judith will tell us, he hiked 45 of the 46 mountains in the Adirondacks, and one of his first major articles was about the inadequacy of existing law to protect the environment. And as we heard last night, he escaped from his life as a lawyer in Washington by being hired back to the Yale Law School in 1958, along with Guido Calabresi and Bob Stevens. What's interesting is the letter he got from Douglas, who says, "Yale is not a particularly exciting place, but it's a great challenge to be in that citadel of reaction." And as you heard from Guido last night, he was assigned by the great dean, Eugene Rostow, to teach an entirely unfamiliar subject, property. And so let us say that Never let anyone say that decanal coercion has produced nothing of value. Now, interestingly, one of his early great pieces, as you again heard, was about Billy Budd. You all know the story about how Captain Vere is forced to try Billy Budd, who strikes out and kills the horrible Claggart. And then the question is, in a drumhead court, must you enforce the law even when it's unjust? Charles decides that yes, you must. That is the tragedy of justice in Billy Budd. But it turned out that this was all growing out of the story of Chief Justice of Massachusetts, Lemuel Shaw, who upheld the constitutionality of the Fugitive Slave Act, something that was written about at great length by Charles's colleague and later intellectual successor, Bob Cover. And I think we'll hear more about Bob Cover's role in Goldberg versus Kelly. But it was in teaching this required subject, property, that Charles found his first hook in the idea of property. And what he said was, we need to make a conceptual transition from largesse to entitlement, to the notion that simply by being born human, a person wins certain inalienable rights against society and an entitlement to call on its resources. So welfare benefits are neither welfare nor benefits. They're entitlements that the state may not take away without due process of law. My wife, Christy Fisher, is a longtime legal services attorney. The unit that she worked in was not called the benefits unit, it was called the entitlements unit. Said Charles, today more and more of our wealth takes the form of rights or status. These forms of largesse are closely linked to status, must be deemed to be held as of right. And he also noted that this is our bulwark against the state. If an individual is to survive, he must have protection against society's collective ruthless pressures. There must be sanctuaries or enclaves no majority can reach. You must create a new property which will give us that sanctuary. His idea led to the new due process. The idea that the new property created a sanctuary where individual flourishing can occur. That if you actually have a property interest that's protectable, you can't be stripped of them without due process of law, which greatly empowers individuals against the state. And so in one fell swoop, this article, the most cited article in the history of the Yale Law Journal, revolutionized not just public and private law, but also procedure, administrative law, and public interest lawyering, because it reimagined personhood. Individuals were not just beggars. They were not just supplicants. They are free and equal, rights-bearing citizens, entitled to enjoy gateway rights in society as part of the blessings of liberty that Constitution guarantees to ourselves and our posterity. With a single scholarly article, Reich breathed life into his mentor's idea of the living Constitution. Now this led then to its judicial adoption. We'll hear much more about this from people who know more than I. But Goldberg versus Kelly addressed two fundamental questions. What is property? That includes public assistance. And what does it require? The opportunity for a pre-termination evidentiary hearing. You can think of this as Justice Brennan's thick theory, due process in the eye of the receiver, asking whether the government has treated someone fairly, whether individual dignity has been honored, whether the state acknowledges the worth of an individual. This, he says, requires more than proficiency in legal analysis, balancing the reason and passion that mark a given age. Or as Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. had put it, even a dog knows the difference between being kicked and stumbled over. Due process is in the eye of the receiver. So in articulating this vision of who am I, Charles also started to clarify who are we. And he says in discussing the new property many years later, we have democratic ideals, but we spend them in large institutions opposed to those ideals. They're authoritarian, they reject individual liberty, there's little concept of ownership of property or due process, they're based on inequality and extreme hierarchy. The ideals we cherish struggle with the reality that most of our lives is spent in settings that deny these ideals. And he says, individual liberty is threatened by economic control over the people and their resulting dependency. The issue is whether we can place limits on such control. So, a fundamentally lonely person, Charles Reich, is suddenly asking not just the question, who am I, but the communitarian question, who are we? And he starts to find this community through public dissent. Here he is picketing against a Dow Chemical executive. Interestingly, he now resorts to civil disobedience. He says in the Torah Law Review, a law professor does have a legitimate concern with what is being done in the name of constitutional government. You can see this as a breaking away from Captain Veer. We're not condemned to accept unjust laws. We not only can, but we must reform the laws of society to accommodate the laws of nature. And Charles gradually became a different kind of teacher. He started teaching at Yale College. He began to find himself as a person. He started to join the Yale community and become a communitarian. He found himself among a generation that was finding itself. He had that experience of what we today call coming out. And as Guido said so beautifully last night, his extraordinary rhetorical gifts made him the voice of a new generation of revolution. And so the famous greening of America, Consciousness 1, Consciousness 2, Consciousness 3, this utopian vision, he said, memorably, that greening of America would break through societal rigidity like flowers, pushing up through a concrete pavement. And the greening of America, the title carefully chosen also to capture the rebirth of the environmental movement. But for this, Charles was mocked. Doonesbury called him Professor Green. He said that even at the same time as he was being laughed at, his new consciousness was so universally accepted that now everybody feels they wrote the book. It could still be reality, but it's viewed like a fantasy or dream that people woke up from with a headache. Because the new property was really double-edged. It can secure individual freedom against the state, but because the government controls the contours of the new property, it's always tempted to use its power to control some unrelated kind of behavior. In other words, the state and the individual are inextricably linked. And that's what led to the rival theory of due process, Matthews versus Eldridge, in 1976. Jerry Mashaw's famous description, 3 factors in search of a theory of value. And so suddenly we had a struggle between a thin and thick theory of due process, one based on intrinsic versus instrumental concerns, Kantian versus Benthamite concerns, dignitary versus cost-benefit concerns, the theories of Michelman and Mashaw versus Richard Posner, or what you could simply call due process in the eye of the receiver versus due process in the eye of the state. And in this, in the world of the courts, the Berger court, the thin theory won. Compare Richard Posner's theory of efficiency, error costs, and direct costs being the sole determinants of due process with Charles's thick theory, backed by Frank Michelman, talking about the limits of instrumental explanation, and Jerry Mashaw. Due process is about more than accuracy, but fraternal values like dignity, equality, tradition. So Charles's dream of the greening of America was dashed. He left Yale to find himself further. He moved to San Francisco. He published The Sorcerer of Bolinas Reef. To read it is to learn about his coming to self-awareness in 1967 in the Summer of Love. But he began to think more and more about what he called opposing the system. The battles he had fired, the first shots raged on. The incomplete work of the greening revolution convinced him there's a system that's rigged against the average person. And so the system tells people what they own, the new property, what they can aspire to, even who they can love. And when Guido brought him back to 1991 to Yale Law School, we had begun, all of these battles had intensified. The first Gulf War, which he saw like Vietnam, the environmental struggle, today's battles over the rights of immigrants and refugees, the McCarthyite struggle between liberty and security, reborn on September 11th, 2001. And with his rare combination of empathy and insight, Charles supported in all of these struggles the new generation, including me. So it was during that period that I worked on issues relating to the Gulf War and refugees, and it was Charles who was constantly coming by to say, how can I help? At the same time, he was renewing his plea for a greening of America, a better America and a better world, and his book, Opposing the System. And illustrating what he was talking about, consider a battle that a number of us here, my friend Ray Brescia, Roger Citron himself, Brant Goldstein last night, the rights of individuals on Guantanamo. Who has more rights, human beings or iguanas? The Eastern District of New York had held that the Due Process Clause applies on Guantanamo, but that ruling was vacated. And after September 11th in 2004, it comes back to the Supreme Court, which finally gives an American citizen on Guantanamo due process, applying Matthews versus Eldridge. But Sandra Day O'Connor's plurality opinion, while starting by citing the great due process cases, Cleveland Board of Education versus Loudermill, Mullane, Fuentes versus Shevin, says these essential constitutional promises may not be eroded. But then, using Matthews, shifts to the thin theory. These proceedings may be tailored so they don't burden the executive. They allow hearsay, shifting the burden against the detainee. And they say more process would have questionable additional value in light of the burden on the government. Two more cases then force the US government to concede that the detainees have a right to habeas corpus, but the government continued to argue that they have rights on habeas, but no due process rights to assert. In other words, a right to assert no rights. It's hard to imagine a thinner theory of due process is more clearly in the eyes of the state, or a greater vindication of Charles's image of a system and state that won't recognize personhood. So in closing, when you think about Charles today, in the age of Donald Trump, at the closing, it looks like, of an impeachment trial, isn't it easy to be jaded and cynical about his utopianism? Guido said, was his vision completely correct? No. Prophets rarely are, but did he see an enlightenment most of us missed altogether? Absolutely. I think we should remember his life journey as an anthem to human rights. It forms the backgrounds for the struggles that remain us still, to recognize personhood for minorities, LGBTQs, immigrants, to address extreme inequality, to secure basic entitlements, for example, to health care, an existential struggle for a sustainable environment. Decades later, his vision continues to provoke and inspire. Which brings me back to the purple chair. Really, the story of reclaiming his chair was about who am I, reclaiming property, restoring his personhood, by again feeling whole but now reborn. It was about who are we, reclaiming his rightful place in the Yale Law School community and in the social movements and justice movements the Yale Law School was fighting for, and saying what we must do, rage against the machine. Guido invoked the image of the natural versus the machine, a living constitutional vision of liberty, fostering individual self-awareness and flourishing, equality, treating all as equals based on the content of their character, community, a search for a more perfect union, not a more divided union, and due process, empathetically understood in the eyes of the receiver, not the state. Will we get there? Maybe not soon, but after all, Charles always said there was a 46th summit that we must imagine climbing. So can we remember his legacy today? I felt lost, but now finally I'm home and I'm whole. So welcome home, Charles, to your community. We will continue your work and may you rest in peace. Thank you.